I've got quite the crew with me tonight to discuss Big Bojo's blockbuster appearance. Our very own international editor, Isabel Oakeshott, plus Talk TV's chief political commentator, Peter Cardwell, and co-founder of Us For Them, Molly Kingsley. Well, I think you've had probably one of the busiest days of your career, Isabel, haven't you? I think you've been over a show since midday or something.
I think I've had an easier day than both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
Yes, absolutely right. But, I mean, I heard you talking to Piers, and I was pleased that you kind of stood up against his rather kind of dismissive tone, which I thought he took about Boris Johnson, because a lot of people are just looking at Boris Johnson and going, it's all his fault, if it wasn't for him, everything would have been fine. And it's really not about that.
Well, they also seem to think that he was faking that emotion.
Right.
And as I've said on a number of our programmes today, you know, I have observed Boris Johnson at fairly close quarters for a decade and a half. And that wasn't bumptious Boris. That was a genuine display of emotion when he talked about the tragic year of 2020.
Yeah.
And I think what we saw today was something totally other than what Piers Morgan represented there. I don't think that Boris was defaulting to his usual dissembling and lying and so on. I think he was making a genuine effort to acknowledge that mistakes were made. He repeatedly did so, in fairness.
Yeah.
And to say that, of course, there are things that could have been done differently. But what he attempted to do, and people will have different views on how successful this was set out just the magnitude of the decision that was on his shoulders as we approached that first national lockdown. And the fact that he was having to weigh so very carefully the terrible consequences, which he already knew. Many of us could already see were coming if you shut down society for long periods. And I think that came across quite powerfully, actually.
Yeah, let me, just before I come to Peter and Molly, let's have another look at what he said about the cabinet responsibility.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
sit down.
Of
please stop.
COVID
Johnson.
victims.
Please sit down. Please sit down, or I'm afraid you'll have to leave the hearing room. I'm sorry, if you don't sit down, I'm going to ask the ushers to get you to leave.
But I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families.
Boris Johnson to what we've seen previously.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that, you know, for Boris Johnson, he clearly feels slightly uncomfortable in these kind of situations, doesn't he? I mean, he's used to being the star of the show.
It very much had to me. I don't know what you thought, Mike, but I very much got the sense of sort of being in the headmaster's office, feeling sort of head slightly bowed, definitely not waffling, not blustering, actually being contrite and apparently apologising.
Hugo Keith wasn't very fair on him, I didn't think. I mean, not only did he continually seek to humiliate him, as you said in your introduction, which I think was unreasonable, but he also quite often was wrong. I mean, Hugo Keith wheeled out the wrong statistics on our record relative to other countries. That's pretty important, actually. You shouldn't have got that wrong.
But I think so, Molly, because I mean, you're a critic of the government and what they did, and as we all are in various different ways. But I think that, you know, Isabel's right. The way the questioning has always been aimed at kind of trying to catch people off guard, trying to catch them out, trying to make out that they were, you know, useless and negligent and all of those things, which I think, given the way some people have been talking, would suggest that they weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I thought Boris came out really well, actually, today. And I was, you know, I've been a very harsh critic of him over the last few years. And I thought he came out really well. I thought Hugo Keith came off terribly, actually. He got things wrong. You've mentioned the excess death. He also well, he referred to an infection, I don't know if you heard this, infection mortality rate of 2%, which is about 10 times higher than the actual rate. And he said that, you know, right at the beginning, that's in the excess death point. And that really framed his entire attitude. And I think that speaks really to the fundamental flaw of this inquiry. It is starting from the wrong base point, and it is not asking the key question, did lockdowns work and did it benefit the huge harm?
Right. And I'm going to come back to that, but let's have a look at what Metro are saying in the morning. They've got a front page out, sorry for your loss. Boris Johnson at the COVID inquiry. They say, teary former PM apologises for pain and suffering during a tragic year. Relatives furious. They're standing up to interrupt the apology. I mean, I think, again, you know, as I said at the top, there's an awful lot of questions I'd like to know the answers for about China. and about what the international community was doing and what British government was
Well,
doing.
Michael
And,
Gove
you
got
know,
shut down, Mike, when that happened, when he
Yeah.
brought up
Well,
the
when he first-
origins
yeah,
of,
the actual
of
lab leak,
COVID.
yeah.
He was shut down, and Hugo Keith, who's I just find incredibly patronising, saying that's not in the scope of this inquiry. I
Right.
mean,
It matters not.
It does-
One of
It
his
matters not,
favourite
he always
favourite-
says that.
Who
Yeah.
even talks like that?
yes.
There's really...
But I mean, I'm sick to death of these barristers, to be honest. I mean, everywhere they pop up, you know, as I was saying earlier on today, barristers used to be a particularly reliable form of kind of, you know, British upper class educated individual. They're now kind of, you know, an extension of the James O'Brien programme. You know, they're all going on and on about Brexit. You know, they're always talking about how
Yeah, well,
Boris Johnson's fault for everything.
I
you
fear
know,
we'll get that tomorrow because we haven't had the examination of whether Brexit is to blame for everything that went wrong.
No, they've skipped over that.
Yeah, I
Well,
think
yeah, but we've
they
already
might
heard
get
the
it
relatives. I mean, I
tomorrow.
heard a couple of the relatives saying that, you know, and you wondered, well, what's it going to do with Brexit? They're now hearing that, you know, well, they were just planning for Brexit and the
I mean,
preparedness of
that's
that.
just nonsense.
It's not a
And
story.
I think we should talk about the role of the relatives here because this is another of my bugbears.
Yeah.
That nobody is denying or denigrating the loss of anybody whose loved ones died during the pandemic. But I think the behaviour of those relatives at the inquiry today was reprehensible. It is not for them to heckle the former Prime Minister. It is not for them to stand up and try to disrupt proceedings. These proceedings have been massively distorted by the enormous efforts that have been made to accommodate what their wishes are from the inquiry. And as I've said ad nauseum, this inquiry actually isn't about them. I know they might want it to be about them, but it isn't about them. It is about what we do differently next time. And unfortunately, the relatives on that side are not the most important.
Yeah, I'm
people.
with you. And I mean, it's not a popular view because obviously we're not supposed to be horrible about people who have suffered. But, you know, lots of people have suffered. You could line the place with millions of people who have suffered in one way or another.
The children.
And the
How
children,
about
for a
that?
start. And I also don't think these relatives are in any way representative of people who lost loved ones.
They're not. I mean, we know that, and it is one of the structural problems with the inquiry, that the nature of the call participants are very weighted towards those who have suffered bereavement due to COVID. And that is not to downplay that, as Isabel says. But what about those that suffered bereavement due to lockdown? What about the children, as you say? What about the hospitality industry? The whole, you know, why aren't these people represented in the same way?
But even what I'm saying, Peter, as well, even people who lost their own loved ones are not always the kind of people that want to go and demonstrate at a public inquiry and make a nuisance of themselves for no apparent purpose.
well, I worked with quite a few victims groups when I worked in government, especially in terms of Northern Ireland. And truth and justice are very, very different things to many different people. There will be people sitting at home who will watch Boris Johnson say, do you know what, fair cop, good for you for apologising. Yes, I'm never going to agree with you. I'm never going to vote for you necessarily, but certainly, you know, that's okay. And we'll never know what they think because they won't make their voices heard. But of course we do hear, and as Isabel and Molly says, not to take anything away from what has happened, but there are so many people who will feel very, very emotionally attached to this. They'll make their voice heard, and those who shout the loudest will be heard the most.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, at the end of the day, when you listen to some of them being interviewed as they were afterwards outside saying that they weren't interested in an apology, and then when they said, well, what is it that you want? Well, we want an apology. Well, you've just had one.
You've had one.
You don't like that one, so you want a different one.
She was contrite. I mean, I've heard relatives give these interviews, and again, I'm very sorry. It's horrible to have lost anybody, but he was contrite. He did repeatedly admit that he made mistakes in a way that was really quite humiliating for him.
Yeah, I think so, because this is how, a bit like Tony Blair in Iraq, I mean, this is how he will be remembered, probably, that, you know, there was a guy who could have been a great Prime Minister, but for COVID.
I think just to be totally, and we are being fair to the relatives, by the way, I think on this panel, but just to think about them a little bit more, there are people whose grief is manifested in anger, and actually to hear an apology was not perhaps what they wanted. They wanted to hate Boris Johnson, and that helps them in their grief in some way. I've come across this many times, and in a sense that's okay, but we just have to put that into context.
Does any of this as well touch Rishi Sunak? Because let's not forget, you know, Rishi Sunak likes everybody to think that he just suddenly became Prime Minister, like he was born out of a pod in the back garden and suddenly he was Prime Minister. You know, he was in that government, he was in that cabinet, he was the Chancellor, he was the one that did the Eat Out to Help Out, he was the one that did the furlough scheme. I mean, when is anybody going to ask any questions about him?
So he is due to give evidence.
Next
I'm not
week,
quite
I think.
Just before Christmas.
And I think he's going to get quite a hard time because we've seen from all the testimony in this segment of the inquiry a lot of criticism of Eat Out to Help Out, which Matt Hancock privately called eat out to spread it about,
Right.
which he had taken out of the book that I
Yeah.
wrote with him because he
Right.
didn't want to upset Sunak, because Sunak was Prime Minister
Right.
by that point. But yeah, look, I think that Sunak will come under a lot of pressure, because actually what we do know of Rishi Sunak at the time as Chancellor was that he was also pushing back,
Yeah.
not, in my view, quite hard enough,
Right.
but he was trying to make the case.
Well, he was certainly letting it be known that that's what he was doing.
Yeah.
Whether or not
no,
he was.
he
He
was.
was, yeah.
Yeah, that came out
he-
of the evidence
Yeah.
today, actually.
To
that
be
they-
fair, he was. But I mean, there'll be a lot of hostility to that. You know,
Right.
not everybody will agree that he should have been doing that. So.